Marx talks about alienation, he talks a lot about the body, about being embodied in the world and the destruction that it takes. And if anyone's ever played football understands 2 weeks of more football playing is more destruction on your body. No amount of money is going to recover the damage that happens to your brain and so forth. But this is so the capitalists can make more money on these workers. So anyway, my idea is that if people can talk about this. I'd like to hear more about the Marxist notion of freedom. And I think Marx has some tools to talk about this when he talks about exploitation and alienation.
Yep.
So I got an open stack. If you want to make a comment, ask a question, just raise your hand and I'll give you a signal when I see it. If you guys notice, we do have a camera and microphone down here. David Barsamian of Alternative Radio said he wanted to. He's a big fan of Ahmed's and wanted a copy of tonight's presentation and hopefully he'll be able to use it on his radio show. All right, back here.
Throughout Marx's writings and in responses to Marx, terms like revolution and revolutionary are used pretty broadly, as well as terms like transformation. But there are few, if any, deep accounts of what those mean. They're used very casually in a lot of ways. This is revolutionary. And in some ways they're used as descriptive of what we might imagine as an anarchic movement or rebellion. But there isn't, I haven't really found a deep investigation or even a normative claim, hey, here's what we should mean by revolutionary, here's what we should mean by transformation. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, because I'm sure you're more well-read in all this than I am. And it's just one of my ongoing curiosities. If we're gonna use those terms in a positive sense, we've got to spend more time on them.
All right, I got an open stack right now.
The idea of, I'm just asking, so the fact that we all live in America and other people live in the same countries as us, and the preconceived notion of those two societies of that violence is bad, not a good thing, is it still a common idea that the revolution of Marxism should be carried out with an AK-47, or is it through peaceful movements?
All right, we've got some good questions out there. The issues Jose raised there talk about Marx's use of terminology, revolution, and then talking about is violence necessary for revolution?
Like, where is it still a feasible way?
Right. So yeah, I want everybody to feel free to talk, to discuss it, to pick up on any of these topics or ask a question in there down front.
What would Marx change in Sweden today? What would he add in order to that?
All right, I got an open stack again. Wait.
Whatever you want.
I think going back to the first question brought up about Marxism's relationship to freedom and the notion, especially in westernized nations, that Marxism takes away personal liberty, I think that comes from a lack of understanding that there is, in the capitalist power structure, the oppressed class, that is all of us, that is a huge majority, and then there is the oppressing class, the ruling business political elite, and the way they use the concept of liberty is by giving themselves more liberty to accumulate wealth. So when they say liberty and therefore personal freedom, therefore their own freedom to further take away our freedom. So really Marxism is more of an ideology, I think, for personal freedom that values every human being than capitalism.
Going to the question about what forms should revolution take, I think it's important to kind of try to understand what Marx means by revolution, how this should be carried out. What we're talking about when we talk about revolution is the self-emancipation of the working class, of the proletariat. So this isn't can't be kind of looked at through the lens of how this is carried out like say in Cuba, where you have a smaller group of armed insurrection or whatever, armed people who are able to overthrow a government. We're talking about actually uniting the whole of the proletariat and to be able to use their power, which is related to the means of production. Because the proletariat, the industrial workers, workers in general, working class, has a very specific and special place in relation to the means of production. So what this means is that they can, by uniting, they can bring the capitalists to their knees, absolutely. And by uniting together and be able to use the tools that capitalism has given them, they can come together and they can be able to transform society in this way without having to rely on violent means as the first or the overall means.
I would like to know more about, particularly you were just talking about like the proletariat. I would like to, for you to address, like particularly within the working class, within like the proletariat, where you have race differences, you have gender, you have religious differences and things like that, and how did Marx address that? And even in the present day, in some ways, how do we start to move towards that revolution? Do we still have those groups?
Yeah. These are some great questions. And so I'm going to try to answer them, but do so in a kind of speedy manner. First, on political equality versus freedom. A question, Marx's views of political equality and his views on freedom. And you mentioned the concept of alienation. For Marx, one of the things that is critical is the fact that people lose the control over their own labor power. So the whole discussion about where you are controlled rather than controlling your own labor power. And you're controlled because of the structures of the society in which you no longer own anything except your labor power to sell, i.e. you can get a job, but you don't own or share in the product. And it's that which produces human alienation. He says really, I'll give you Marx himself, the realm of freedom actually begins only where labor which is determined by necessity and mundane considerations ceases. Thus, in the very nature of things, it lies beyond the sphere of actual material production. Now, by mundane considerations, he means like having to eat. He's not saying that's not important, but in other words, we're compelled to act in certain ways rather than creating structures which we have control over. That's really the leap into freedom. And he says that you have to have political equality to begin with. And in order to be able to fight for that, in order to change the structure of society that compels you to act in particular ways. The question on exploitation and football, part of it is that, for those people who want to read some of the conditions in sports, I highly recommend the writings of David Zirin, who I think has spoken here before, and has a couple of books on the sports industry that he's just put out, and I know he's working now on a book with John Carlos, the autobiography of John Carlos, who was one of the athletes in the '68 Olympics who raised the Black Power salute, and it's the story of his life. But the reason I go off in that digression is that I think sports has become such a moneymaker in society that we also lose sight of certain things. That is, the average life of an NFL football player, and I don't mean their physical, I mean as an NFL football player, and if David was here, he'd give me the exact one, I think it's 2.5, 3 years, not much more. It's something in there is the average playing life of a football player, and then they're wrecked. I mean, they're wrecked, and not everybody is at the top tier. So even though these are big, big salaries, when you look at the actual distribution of that income, you find that a whole slew of people in all of the major sports industries make much, much less than the superstars. I used to be a Bulls fan when Michael Jordan played, so my figures go back. I'm not, that was in the old days. But I think that's the first thing to establish. The second thing is how much the owners themselves make out of these human beings. That is, that the wealth is created by the players. And we were just talking about it earlier. in certain fields, athletes get nothing, like collegiate sports, in particular collegiate football. So, you know, and you don't get big, long exposés. You do get the exposés of the superstar players and how they spend their money and so on. I don't remember seeing too many about the owners and what they do with their money and who they pay off. And you get the idea. I just, exploitation exists under this society. Some are paid much better for it, and like some of the very rich football players who themselves begin to invest in other things. But from the majority of athletes, I don't think that's the, you know, that's the level that we're talking about. I think you're right to bring up the question of their own bodies and what happens to them as a result of their participation. On revolution and AK-47s, two aspects. Yes, I think that there's been a significant change on the views about violence in the United States and in Western Europe. There's been a real effort to try to transform people's views on violence, but it's a kind of peculiar effort to transform views on violence because I come from an area of the world, I was born in Cairo, Egypt, in which violence is pretty familiar part of daily life, except that we don't focus on it as such. And I'm